bringing independent piecemeal actions against content creators for violating COPPA, that may discourage content creators from posting content on YouTube. So the analogy that I think of, imperfect, is the expression about shooting fish in a barrel. And YouTube is the barrel, and the content creators are the fish.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Video Call-In Show. That show that invites you to be a live video guest on this program to talk about whatever you want to talk about. Tonight, however, I'm going to talk about that which has gotten so many people in an uproar, and rightfully so in some cases. I think most of the answers are contained within the FTC's press conference held just a few days ago. I plan on going through a few clips tonight. I thought it was appropriate that someone do this because there's some things that people aren't talking about, and I hope to cover those. Perhaps my commentary will give you a little bit of insight. Again, or I should point out that I am not a lawyer. Do not take what I say as legal advice. If you find yourself in a position of not knowing where to go with this, then you really need to secure the services of a lawyer and make sure that you're protected. There are going to be some eye-opening statements said by both the chairman, Joe Simmons, and the Bureau Director, Andrew Smith, on the subject. Like I said, most of these are self-explanatory. They literally outline exactly what they plan to do, how they arrived at the penalties for Google and YouTube. And then, even more importantly, what it means to us creators. First off, they go through introductions for both Joe Simmons and Andrew Smith.
So thank you very much for being here, and let me present Chairman Joe Simons.
Guys, while you're here, make sure you throw a like, you follow it, and of course, subscribe. This isn't the normal format, but I thought this affects all of us in one way or another. So I thought it was very, very important that we cover this in full. But I think it's information that a lot of people are confused about, and I more than anyone don't want that to be.
Good morning, and welcome to the Federal Trade Commission. Today, I am pleased to announce that Google and YouTube have agreed to pay $170 million and to implement strong conduct relief in settlement of an action brought by the FTC and the New York State Attorney General's Office for alleged violations of the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act.
Now, I want to point out that the reason that he says alleged is because it's a settlement. They did not go to court with this. It was a settlement between Google, YouTube, and the FTC. So I want to make that very, very clear so that we can use that as future reference for what they say later on in the conference. Let's continue.
Commonly known as COPPA. Let me start by explaining why we allege that Google and YouTube violated our rule implementing COPPA.
This is important.
COPPA requires that certain websites and apps get parents' consent before collecting personal information from children. The definition of personal information includes cookies used in behavioral advertising. The COPPA rule applies differently to third parties serving behavioral ads versus creators of child-directed content. While the content creators are strictly liable for COPPA compliance, third parties are subject to COPPA's requirements only where they have actual knowledge that the website or service they're serving the ads to is child-directed.
Now, I find this part particularly interesting. He says that content creators are directly responsible, well, the platforms that they host their content on aren't directly liable. I'm completely befuddled as to why that would be the case. You got to remember that content creators aren't dropping cookies, although the point they're trying to make is that we're knowingly uploading content to a platform that may or may not cater to children. And that's an important distinction here. Although I still believe it's misdirected since we don't have direct control over that outside of now being able to classify our content for children or not for children. So let's continue.
To put it in context for today's case, YouTube as a general audience platform is not directly, strictly liable under COPPA for the content of the videos uploaded by others to its platform, unless it has actual knowledge that the content is child-directed.
This will come into play very clearly here soon, especially as it relates to that declaration that we're all asked to make.
Our complaint alleges numerous instances in which YouTube and Google had actual knowledge of the child-directed nature of channels and videos on the YouTube platform.
This is honestly where I believe that the reason we're in the spot we're in today is because this act that was passed in 1998, revised in 2013, was on Google and YouTube's radar. They chose to ignore it. I want you to keep that in mind as we watch these.
This is the basis for the FTC to find that Google and YouTube violated COPPA. Our order accomplishes three important purposes. First, it imposes a substantial monetary judgment of $170 million, with $136 million going to the Federal Trade Commission as a civil penalty, and $34 million going to the state of New York. The $170 million judgment is 30 times larger than the largest COPPA civil penalty the FTC has ever previously obtained. It is 3 times larger than any privacy penalty assessed against Google anywhere else in the world. And it is 10 times larger than the civil penalties we have obtained in all of our 31 prior COPPA cases combined.
This is backpatting.
A penalty of this magnitude sends a strong signal about the importance of children's privacy. Second, the order requires the companies to refrain from using or benefiting from the data that they previously collected from child-directed videos or channels. Third, the order imposes additional obligations on Google and YouTube that go beyond the requirements of COPPA. The order requires YouTube and Google to notify channel owners about their potential COPPA obligations. It also requires YouTube to develop a system or a mechanism through which channel owners must identify their child-directed content on the YouTube platform.
Honestly, it's my assessment that Google and YouTube should have known this well in advance of the COPPA-apocalypse, which, incidentally, the term COPPA-apocalypse, I thought for sure I had coined that a few days ago on a different live stream. Then I learned that it's a trending hashtag on Twitter. We can't win them all. let's go on.
So that such content can be treated in a COPPA-compliant manner. This is particularly significant because COPPA does not require platforms such as YouTube to determine whether the videos posted by others are directed to kids or not. Going forward, YouTube and Google will automatically have knowledge of and COPPA liability for all child-directed content designated through this mechanism.
You get the irony there. First off, he says that the platforms aren't responsible for knowing, but yet he says that they now have to enforce it. I find that very, very odd. But we can discuss that later. By the way, after I'm done with this, I am going to open up the video lines, and you guys are more than welcome to jump on and give your opinions. Maybe I'm wrong about some of this. I've been wrong before, and I don't mind being told so. If it's a convincing argument, my gosh, I will change my opinion. So let's continue.
In this way, the order prevents YouTube and Google from turning a blind eye to the existence of kids' content on the YouTube platform. Finally, YouTube must provide annual training about compliance with COPPA for employees that deal with the channel owners. None of this is required by law. No other company in America is subject to these types of requirements, and they will impose significant costs on YouTube.
No one as of yet. No, actually, what he's saying is that the requirements that are not required by law, no one else is. But I want to make sure that that's not misconstrued as no one is also held accountable for being COPPA compliant.
This case sends strong messages to third parties like YouTube, channel owners, and the business community as a whole. For YouTube and other third parties like it that serve ads, they can't market their ability to get child viewers on the one hand and disavow knowledge that children are using their service on the other. They can't rate videos as kid-directed for one purpose and then say they have no COPPA liability when they collect information from kids watching those videos. For those who create child-directed content to upload on YouTube, the message from today's case is that the FTC considers these videos and channels to be websites or online services directed to children under the rule and thus strictly liable for compliance with COPPA.
Now that's a very, and the reason I am spending more time, because I don't spend near as much time on the Bureau Director as I am right now the chairman, because he makes a lot of the points right up front in his opening. It's 6 minutes 42 seconds, but there are a lot of great points and an overview points that I think we all need to take away from this. I implore everyone to watch it front to back, because when I get further into this, I'm going to go over just a few select questions that were posed to Mr. Smith, and that is because he primarily answered questions. So let's continue.
Once our order has been effected for a period of time, the Commission will conduct a sweep of the YouTube platform to determine whether child-directed content is being properly designated as such in order to ensure that the channels themselves are complying with COPPA. Finally, to the business community at large, let me be clear. The FTC takes its obligation to enforce COPPA seriously. If companies violate COPPA, the FTC will take aggressive action, require corrective measures, and use its authority to seek substantial civil penalties.
When he says companies, make no mistake, he's also talking about small YouTubers, right? You're considered a sole proprietor, and that's my assessment. But the way they describe it later on, they lump in creators as business owners, especially because, you know, anytime you start making money from a venture, you are in a sense an unwritten sole proprietor. So keep that in mind when he says they're going to go after folks aggressively. I just want to make that
Let
point.
me close by thanking our partners at the New York State Attorney General's office, and I would like to thank in particular the FTC staff attorneys, Kristen Cohen, Tiffany George, and Peter McGee, for their tireless work on this case. Thank you, and I'd like to turn the podium now over to Andrew Smith, our Bureau Director.
Okay, so it's interesting. Listen to, he talked about New York and, of course, the lawyers. Mr. Smith, coming up, is going to talk to us about the proceeds from this settlement are to be distributed and why that is. So we'll get to that, but I wanted you to make note of that. Now, the next one, the Bureau Director, Andrew Smith, comes up. He's primarily there to answer questions, although he does give a little bit of a commentary up front, and we'll listen to that now.
Thank you. So the floor is open for questions. I wanted to reiterate, while you're collecting yourselves for questions, that some of the points the chairman made.
He does exactly that. And I'm skipping this part, of course, because he covers it exactly the same. But he does have something to say very shortly.
$100 million of that is dedicated to us. So with this action, we are actually reimbursing the Treasury and the taxpayers for our operating expenses for this year. So no need for all of you to thank me now, but you're welcome.
I'm not going to thank Mr. Smith, and I'll tell you why I won't thank Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith just said that the money that has been taken from a private business is now repaying the efforts of the government. Okay, that's exactly it. But it's not thankworthy. And I'll tell you why it's not thankworthy is because that money's got to come from somewhere. And you've heard me say this before, that that companies don't crap money. They literally get money from you and I. People pay those fines. And all that money that came from Google are monies paid by us, more other companies, and it's a vicious cycle in that. But so I don't ever take solace in the fact that the government has been compensated using whose ever funds, unless it's from a foreign entity, as something to celebrate. So I just had to jab that in there.
And maybe most importantly, that this action is changing YouTube's business model, that YouTube cannot bury its head in the sand. YouTube cannot pretend that it's not aware of the content on its platform and hope to escape liability for COPPA. YouTube is going to be explicitly held liable for complying with COPPA where it has actual knowledge of the content. YouTube is going to be required to seek out that actual knowledge through requiring content creators and channel owners to specifically designate whether they are directed to children. And as the chairman noted, not only can we sue Google and YouTube for compliance with COPPA, but also individual channel owners and content creators. And once this order has been fully implemented, we intend to conduct a sweep of the YouTube platform to determine whether there remains child-directed content on the platform with respect to which personally identifiable information continues to be collected. So, question?
So he goes into this in more detail later, but I find it extraordinarily curious that he says that they're under YouTube, or I should say platforms, because this is not the only one that's going to be hit. Platforms, and we'll get into that in a little bit too. Platforms are not going to be held liable unless they have direct knowledge. Now they're going to have to actively seek out knowledge. I think that's a contradiction by the FTC, and I hope that they address that moving forward, because you can't tell someone that they're not liable for other people's actions and then say that you have to go out and find those people who are making you liable for their actions. It's kind of an odd way to say that, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So I found that very curious. And then he talks about the sweep that they're going to do. And this is a point that a lot of people have questions about that is in the next clip, actually. And I think it's worth hitting.
Yes, there's a question right in front here.
Thank you, Dave Pereira from Amlex. You've referred multiple times to the sweep that the FTC will conduct on YouTube channels, and it's an important part of the enforcement of this order. Yet there are 23 million channels that upload a combined 500 hours of video every minute. So, given that amount of content, what kind of meaningful sweep can you conduct?
Well, I think that we have a variety of tools at our disposal to cull through those 23 million channels and in an expeditious way. I mean, this is the way that we generally enforce COPPA, is by actually reviewing content to determine if it's directed to children. We have a variety of factors in our rule that we consider when determining whether or not content is directed to children. And so that's the way we do business. It has been successful so far. I think that I have no doubt that it will be similarly successful with respect to YouTube, despite the large quantity of information on the platform.
Now, this is important because he goes into detail about how machine learning and algorithms may not be the correct tool for this. And I think what he's implying is that it's going to be more of a human sort of sweep. In other words, they're going to rely, and this is my assessment of it, they're going to rely on information submitted to them. That's how they actually came to this lawsuit. Now, some of the privacy advocates had brought this to their attention, and they decided to go after. He says YouTube's a barrel. I would argue that YouTube is just a big fish in a much larger barrel. And the complaints came down because YouTube is that big fish. So they have decided that to make an example of YouTube. Well, they also don't want to rely on machine learning to find out how egregious the violations are. They're going to wait for other people to tell them exactly what what content they think is trying to skirt by as not made for kids, but yet still directed at kids. And mark my words on that. I don't have any proof one way or the other, but I can almost guarantee that that's going to be the way they have to do it. They don't have the manpower to go through each individual channel and video and all that. I mean, you're talking about 24 million channels, 23 they said, I think, and you can't imagine how many individual videos there are that they would have to go through. And this is even after the initial wave of choices are concerned, right? The declarations. So many people are going to automatically choose their entire channel as kid oriented. Others are going to choose individual videos, and a vast majority of the people, if I was a betting man, are going to say that their content is not directed at kids. Once that first wave goes through, once the self-policing that YouTube plans on doing is done, then they're going to go through and they're going to rely on tips. Really, I mean that's just the only way they can do it. That's now he's going to talk about a little bit about misidentification of your content, and I think this is really fascinating.
Yes, Margaret.
Commissioner Slaughter raised concerns that this would maybe incentivize content creators to misidentify programming to ensure that they continue to receive revenue from behavioral advertising. Can you respond to that criticism, and how might the FTC combat that issue?
So I think that's a valid concern. There is apparently, we've learned in this investigation and just learned from, in the now information in the public domain, that there are benefits to gathering information and targeting advertising. And so it is possible that content creators will misdesignate. So one response to that is that's why we're conducting the sweep. The second response to that is that there will be consequences for content creators who misdesignate, including being kicked off the YouTube platform. So if content creators are not sincere or forthcoming with YouTube and designating content as being directed to children, there will be consequences for them. We also think that YouTube has strong incentives to police its platform, both to avoid future enforcement actions by the FTC, but also because it's offering this platform to content creators. And if the FTC is bringing independent piecemeal actions against content creators for violating COPPA, that may discourage content creators from posting content on YouTube. So the analogy that I think of, imperfect, is the expression about shooting fish in a barrel. And YouTube is the barrel, and the content creators are the fish. And so it's a place where this content is centralized, and essentially it's easy for us to find.
I find that a little bit of an odd. I wouldn't say that's an analogy imperfect. I liked mine earlier, using his same analogy against the actual barrel. But so it makes it easy to find. It doesn't address the question as what if. Well, I did. It does address the question as what if you misidentify your content? You are going to see penalties, and then he, like I said, he encapsulates that into a. I would say clumsy. And Mr. Smith, if you're watching this, I don't mean to besmirch the the analogy, but I don't know that it's imperfect. I would say that we're easy pickings because we are kind of centralized, and this is the largest video audience out there. It just happens to be. But I think more importantly is that our takeaway should be that they can and will come after individual creators. And I know we knew this, but it's good to hear it from the horse's mouth, if you will. Now, he goes on to say what COPPA is and what COPPA isn't. And I think these are all questions posed, of course, by journalists in the room and on the phone. So let's get to that one specifically.
It's important to keep in mind what the COPPA rule does and what the COPPA rule doesn't do. So what COPPA does is it prohibits the collection of personally identifiable information from children under the age of 12 and under without verifiable parental consent.
Now, I want to break it here because I think this is of extreme importance. One, this is where I think YouTube is screwed up. they haven't limited the age. I mean, you can limit your content to 18 and above, but they really haven't, outside of starting up a new account, they haven't limited or they don't have age restrictions, and that was a huge misstep, and it's why we're feeling it now. If they had proper age limiting or parental consent for going onto YouTube, because you can go on YouTube without an account, and then I don't think we would be seeing the same sort of problem. I get it, man. It was a financial decision. You start locking out your site and don't make it free access. It's tough to build an audience at that point. But once they had the audience, I think they missed an opportunity to avoid a lot of this by age restricting. I just had to throw that in there.
On the internet, though, you don't know who your users are. So what the COPPA rule more specifically does is where the content is directed to children, we are presuming that the users are 12 and under. So if you are...
I hate that statement. I absolutely hate that statement. Presumptions are dangerous. Presumptions are often correct, but they're often incorrect. And the very fact that they are often incorrect, I think, is a huge misstep. It should be provable with the tools that we have available to us today on the interwebs. We should be able to identify most of these. I could be making cartoons like a I don't know, something so benign as a Bugs Bunny and derivative, and yet the only reason I would be liable or I should say not liable, but in non-compliance with COPPA, is that my videos on this platform are publicly available. I'm just saying. So I don't like that at all. I don't know about you guys.
Are the purveyor of child-directed content, we are presuming that your users are 12 and under, and you cannot collect personally identifiable information from them without verifiable parental consent. If, however, you are a general audience platform like YouTube, you don't know what the content necessarily on your platform is. So we, under our rule and under the statute...
I would also argue that you don't know who your audience is. Honestly. I mean, who among us actually has 13 and below? I don't remember what the analytics age group was for that. Who among us has a preponderance of very, very young children watching our content? And how are they tracking that? If they can track it accurately, then those are the numbers they should be going after, not this nebulous presumption. All right?
You are only held liable if you have actual knowledge that the content is child-directed. So that's what we mean.
But he doesn't say that. That's the point.
When we talk about strict liability for content creators, but a knowledge requirement for a general audience platform like YouTube.
Yeah, so what I said stands. Now Mr. Smith is going to talk about the FTC on the changes that YouTube has decided to make. And I thought this was interesting as well.
Joan Solzman from CNET, please go ahead.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you for taking my question. I wanted to see if either the chairman or the director had seen the policy changes YouTube announced this morning, and whether or not any of those go beyond what's included in the complaint and consent decree.
So I have not. This is Andrew Smith, the bureau director. Our chairman has had to leave for a meeting, but I have not seen the changes announced this morning by YouTube. I would say that over the last couple of months, there have been a variety of articles written about the changes that are being contemplated by YouTube. I would say that some of those are probably motivated by our order, and some of those are motivated by an interest in creating what I'll call a kid-safe zone, whether that be an app or a website where there is curated content for kids that parents can have confidence in. And it seems to me as though everyone, all of the stakeholders, the consumer advocates, the privacy groups, the parent advocates, the FTC, members of Congress, and industry would believe that the most beneficial end state would be general audience platforms hosting kid-safe zones where curated content can be provided and kids won't be subjected to violent or otherwise inappropriate content or advertisements or marketing. So I haven't seen this morning's changes, but I'm encouraged by them, and I do think that at least in part they may be motivated by our order and also by our investigation and inquiry. Oh, the changes are based on the order? Okay, so my staff has just said that she just took a look at the changes and they are based on our order.
Kind of think he should have known that. He can't know everything, but I would assume that he's being well briefed, and even at that point he should know that. But I thought that was interesting that that they are aware and they're happy about the changes that YouTube are doing, and it is what it is. I think specifying your content or declaring what your content is the right thing to do. I'll just say that. So we're going to continue to go through. We've got another question about is Google going to police creators themselves? And that's the next question coming up.
And our next question is from Tony Rahm with Washington Post.
Thanks, guys. Maybe this will work this time. I just want to follow up on something that a few others have asked at this point. I don't see anywhere in the order that explicitly requires Google to police YouTube to ensure that channel operators are appropriately labeling. And second, I can't tell if the commission ever sought to require Google to do that, to implement the kinds of machine learning tools that would do that active, constant policing. So can you talk about that and whether Google would be held liable in a case in which, a channel informed the company that it wasn't kid-directed content, but it turned out to be?
So if YouTube has actual knowledge that content is directed to children and it is collecting information about or from users of that content, then it will be liable. So that's just the rule. That's the black letter law. With respect to this idea that Google should have or should implement an algorithm or some sort of a classifier system for reviewing content and putting it in the child-directed bucket, that is something that that may be something that's among the changes announced by Google this morning. Is there anything in Google's announcement, Kristen, that discusses the algorithm? Okay, so the announcement this morning says that the company intends to find child-directed content using machine learning. We thought about imposing that type of a requirement by order, but ultimately decided against.
So they've decided against machine learning, like I told you before. And they also say that Google is going to be, and when I say Google, I mean by extension YouTube, they are going to implement, via statement, they said they were going to implement machine learning to find those folks who are not complying with COPPA. In other words, they do have content directed at children, and they're saying that they don't. And those are the people that are really under fire here. Now, where it gets gray, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but where it gets gray is, how do you know if your content is actually directed at children? And we've all seen the documents, right? We know that it has a lot to do with these particular guidelines. The subject matter being appealing to children, appealing being the key phrase, which is so ambiguous that I can't even imagine how somebody wrote this down and thought it was a good draft. I mean, it's look, here's a great example. Products primarily purchased or consumed by kids. That means that all of those programs, the Lego videos for adults, because there are a lot of adults that enjoy Legos. I'm not one of them, but there is a lot out there. By this rule, by these guidelines, they would have to classify their content as directed at children, or hope that they're not targeted, or fight it. So that's what it boils down to. And there are several other in here. Yeah, like if I ever say whatever, that means that, now maybe this is child directed. I don't think so. Duh, cool games. Ask your parents. The funny part about this, ask your parents, is that it's in this very document. This very document is aimed at children. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to go over the concern over user interface, because what Mr. Smith talks about is, the question was, are you concerned about how this will change the interface? And he says yes, and then he just goes on to talk about apps and how kids-focused apps and websites are where he sees us going. Is very encouraged by that. I totally get that. That's awesome. But it's somewhat inconsequential. I think if we're all concerned about children's personal information, that is 12 and below, then I agree. All that content that is actually directed toward them, the one that could potentially garner their personal information, should be on a protected website. Or app. I got no problem with that at all. I think everyone would agree with that. But you know, the problem here is how to classify it as such, and how nebulous the requirements are, and how we'll all look at this and think, well, we're all going to get snared. Like I just said, you know, I mentioned Legos, and I said, ask your parents, and whatever cool, games. If I just say that, oh, you know what I say in my shows, kids, don't try this at home. Well, does that put me at risk of being construed as a child-directed channel? You see, it's the ambiguousness that just drives everyone nuts. And I don't have an answer for that. I wish I had a concrete answer for that, but I don't. So he also goes, how did they arrive at penalties? And I thought this was interesting as well.
We do have a question from Kirk Victor with FTC Watch.
Hey, Andrew, thanks for taking questions. Most of mine have been covered, but one recurring criticism is, how did you arrive at the penalty figures? That was a criticism both in Facebook and again on this. Can you elaborate a bit on how you came up with these numbers?
So honestly, I would love to elaborate on how we came up with the numbers, but that information is non-public. It involves revenue figures from the various channels that we looked at. That the number was revenue-based, and it was, and as in our other recent COPPA cases, was a multiple of revenue. What we calculated to be the revenue earned from targeted advertising with respect to these channels. Now, keep in mind that YouTube could still serve up contextual advertising.
We'll get into contextual advertising here in a second. What he's saying is they arrived at, one, the 170 million penalty based on how much they knew about YouTube's revenue intake from for personalized ads on those type of programs. And two, they also came up with the $42,000, $530 potential penalty per video based on amalgamation of those channels have made, or the average, I would say. So you can bet your butt that the Baby Sharks and the Peppa Pigs who are running those personalized ads are the ones driving that the figures that the FTC has come up with. That I thought was something that we really needed to point out. I want to finish this clip real fast.
So not targeted ads. And there would be some revenue earned from contextual advertising. And so we tried to not include that in the calculation.
Good for you, FTC, I would say, because if what happened should happen, that rather than be completely ostracized on this platform and others, I would say that the best thing for child-directed content producers or creators would be to move to child-friendly sites that don't collect that personal information and also have a verifiable parental consent. That way, you can run contextual ads. The contextual ad market will go way up, and I think you will still earn money. I mean, it still all boils down to finding out whether or not you are actually targeting children in this. So let's move on to the next clip. He talks about changes as it relates to the importance of the ruling that I thought was quite interesting. And believe me, I've skipped out a few of these. I only have 2 more to go after this. And then we'll get on to some discussion. By the way, all of these links to the FTC press conference, the COPA survey on compliance, which is what I just showed you in text, and also the petition link and a comment for the FTC link, which we'll get to in a moment, are all in the description box below on YouTube. I implore you, look at those and make sure that you visit, you sign the petition, you write a comment, hold the FTC's feet to the fire, if you would. What we want to do is make sure that the rules are more ironclad, which I wish, as you know, I wish YouTube would do the same thing. But I think we need to make sure that we voice our opinion. We have till, I believe it's the 10th of December, but that's the only way that they will get the message. They're already ahead of schedule on revising COPA, which is every 10 years, which is why it was 1998. I think it was enacted in 2000. They waited until 12 or 13 to update it again, and they weren't scheduled for another update until 2021 or 2022. But this, of course, changes the game, and it's up to us to voice our opinion. So please do that. Now, this is important because in this next clip, he's questioned about how aggressively the FTC will enforce the COPA, especially in light of the recent settlement.
Joan Slothman with CNET.
Hi, yes. Thank you for taking another question from me. I actually wanted to ask a question also about the sweeps. There was language in describing them initially about how the FTC is prepared to take aggressive action or corrective measures should they find noncompliance. Can you characterize what sort of measures are on the table and what about them would be aggressive?
Well, I mean, with COPA, COPA is one of those few privacy rules that we enforce that has civil penalties. So when we talk about aggressiveness, we are typically talking about civil penalties. And again, I know that there may be some difference of opinion about this, but in my judgment, this is an eye-popping civil penalty. And again, it represents a multiple of the revenues realized from this practice. And so I think that we would have strong penalties in future cases against content creators and channel owners as well, particularly when we would have a situation where the channel owner was specifically asked, are you child directed? And the channel owner said no.
Did you catch that? That means don't lie, people. That absolutely means don't lie. If you're confused or if you can't determine whether or not your content is child directed or not, then you should seek advice from an attorney who specializes in this. Don't go to a real estate attorney. Don't go to a personal injury attorney. Go find someone, and they're going to pop up soon. In fact, you can probably do a search on YouTube now about lawyers commenting on this very same issue. And many will do it pro bono. Some won't. But find an attorney that can advise you on and look at your content and make sure, because if you're that close, let's say you are that adult Lego content creator, then you want to know. I don't worry about it so much, as you know. This isn't I don't worry about that. Hey kids, don't try this at home. That's a joke, and it's not at all meant for kids. It is meant for our younger audience members, 13 and above. But some people have, content that could be construed as directed at kids, and you really need to find out before you make a statement that could get you in trouble, as looks like you're trying to skirt the process. So take that for what it is. Again, I am not a lawyer. I'm not here for advice. I'm just giving my opinion. So let's continue this.
So
one more after
when
this.
we see those facts, we're going to have to evaluate them. Every case is different. We'll have to evaluate the facts that we are given, and we'll have to evaluate them in context. But if I'm a channel owner, those facts don't look so good for me, I think.
Yeah, and that's the scary part of that. What he's saying is that he will look at it in context. Trust that as far as you can throw it, because context is subjective to many people, and that worries me a great deal. So think about that when you're analyzing your own content. Again, I don't worry about it, but I know there are a lot of people that do and should. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of this. It is the government. As angry as I am with much of what government has become and does, it is the world we live in. So you've got to play the game and fight only when your principles are such that it requires a fight, and do fight for your principles, by the way. So now, to close this out, we've got one more clip. And in this clip, he's talking about whether or not YouTube is the end game, or is the battle royale. Now, we all know that it being the big fish, it was targeted, especially by those consumer groups that brought it to the FTC's attention. But we'll find out from the Bureau Director how far that goes.
I'm Brody from Bloomberg. I guess I better make it good. What's your level of concern about platforms with actual knowledge of data collection of child-directed content out there? Is this the end of the war or the first battle?
Well, it's clearly the first battle, right? Whether it's the only battle, I don't know. My hunch is not, but that, because there are a lot of platforms that may be in this same space, and we don't necessarily think of them. So people often speak of YouTube as being sort of sui generis. It's the only one of its kind. It's the biggest and it's the baddest, and I think that that's probably not right. If you think more broadly about platforms, could it include over-the-top television? I mean, YouTube's there, and what other kinds of platforms that host this kind of user-generated video content? And there are a lot of them, and there are new ones every day. So I think that it is clearly the first battle. Would that it were the only battle and that everybody gets the message. But from our perspective, we're not going to be resting on our laurels. That this is this is a new front in the COPPA enforcement world.
He's talking about how YouTube is not the end-all be-all here. Now, he mentions television, and he skirted around the issue of whether or not other online platforms would be liable as well, or at least under scrutiny, for lack of a better term. But we all know. I mean, we should know. This will cover everything. And again, I'm going to say one more time that it should. And the reason I think it should is because we're all concerned about kids' privacy, and no one should be collecting information about young children without verifiable parental consent. Now, what this boils down to, and again, I implore you to go watch this this entire video, make your own judgments. Like I said, the link is right down in the description box in YouTube, and make sure that you understand it. Analyze your position in this world as a content creator, if you are a content creator. If you're not, think about what it means if you've got kids who are watching YouTube just unfettered, and then do what you think is right, especially when it comes to your content, because you don't want to be on the wrong side of this, and a lot of it's going to be judgment call of your own. So you've got to look at it and think, well, how close am I to being child directed? Because they're looking at, remember, they looked at it from a presumption standpoint. Well, that presumption is going to include, your analytics, which are public knowledge as far as YouTube is concerned. That is easily something they could subpoena. I understand where they were coming from. I understand why they did what they did. I think they screwed us in that they could have been compliant. They could have been guarding against this, but they completely ignored it. And that's why we're in the situation we're in now. So we've got 15 years or more of people creating content, not knowing that they needed to be, or that they were on a platform that was collecting information, personal information from kids. And they should have taken steps to help the people that they invited onto their platform understand if there was any liability involved in that. That is going to do it for me. I want to thank everyone once again for both being on the show, subscribing, for ringing that bell, for following, for sharing my content, which is arguably no better compliment. And I want to leave you with this, as I always do. Make sure that you treat others the way you would want to be treated. If we all did that, this world would be a better place. Take care, folks. We'll see you live.